session, this particular workshop. Okay, so this is the mandatory skill. It is not an optional skill. This is important skill that to attend and understand this Spring Security workshop. Okay, and coming to this, in this workshop, we are going to discuss the concepts or the topics that we are going to discuss. First, I'm going to start today about Spring Security. That's called Spring Security API. After this, next I'll explain about JSON Web Tokens. That is called a JWT. Next, we are also going to discuss about Open Authorization Protocol, OAuth2. So these are the three security concepts that we are going to discuss as part of the session. And we are going to implement the security concepts on an existing REST API application to secure the REST API endpoints. This is the prerequisite for this workshop. That is Spring Boot REST API skills. Okay, then you can understand all the concepts that what I am going to deliver as part of this workshop. Now, when it comes to duration point of view, it will take at least 4 to 5 sessions. Duration will be 4 to 5 sessions. It's not going to just complete in today's session. In one session, we cannot able to complete all these things. So the duration for this workshop will be around 4 to 5 sessions. Okay, today and tomorrow. Next, we'll be having on Monday and Tuesday as well in the next week. Okay, so this is the prerequisite. Apart from this, if you have any other query, you can just ping me in chat. You can directly click on my name and you can ping me on chat so that I can able to reply if you have any other queries. Okay, let's begin with the session now. Now we want to first understand. Now first we want to understand about what this security means. Basically, security is a term which refers to things. As you are aware, otherwise let us know about this. Okay, that is security means there are two core concepts. One is authentication and second one is authorization. Security, whenever you talk about security, whenever we talk about security, security has two core concepts. Two core concepts. In that, one is called authentication and the second one is called authorization. Authentication and authorization. Authentication means just verifying the identity of a user. What is the meaning of verifying the identity? Means it's just like verifying the credentials of user. Nothing but just verifying the username and password. When a client is making a request, to our backend application, we want to verify the identity of the user because we do not want to allow every user to access every part of my application. When I'm defining my backend application, I am defining multiple APIs. In terms of REST, it is called what? Multiple endpoints. Okay, some URLs I want to allow every user to access it. Some URLs I want to make it as accessible to everyone. But some URLs I do not want to make accessible to everyone. For example, login page of Facebook, everybody can access. If you take login page of Facebook, this page is accessible to everyone, whether a user has Facebook account or he doesn't have any account, but login page is accessible to everyone. Login page of Gmail is accessible to everyone. The login page of Facebook and Gmail are not the secured resources. They are not secured. They are accessible to all. They are publicly available resources. But after that, To access any other pages, that Facebook server or Gmail server will first authenticate and authorize the user, and so that it will allow that user to access that particular page. Okay, which means every page in a server may not be secured page. Maybe some pages are accessible to every user, that is publicly available, and some pages are protected or restricted, only authenticated users or authorized users can able to access it. So that's why security has two core concepts. Security has two core concepts. One is authentication and second one is authorization. Authentication means verifying the credentials, that's it. Only verifying the credentials. Okay, verifying the credentials of a user. Okay, that is called identity of a user. That is called authentication. So authentication is a process of verifying the identity of a user. It means verifying the credentials of a user. In simple terms, it means verifying the credentials, user credentials. Credentials are nothing but what? Just username and password. Just username and password. That is called credentials. Okay. Then what is authorization? Every authenticated user is not an authorized user to access a resource. Right. Which means authorization is basically whether this authenticated user has the access permissions or not. Okay. So what does it mean? For example, every employee, okay, every employee can enter into through entrance gate, he can enter into the company premises, right? Everybody can enter with the help of their ID card. They can swipe the card and they can enter, right? But every employee cannot enter into the server room in the on-premises server, okay, located in the company premises. Server room is restricted. Every employee cannot enter into the server room. Server room is restricted. Only authorized users can enter into the server room, but not every authenticated user. Which means every employee does not have a access permission to enter into server room. Right? When you go to any hotels like 5-star hotels as well, when you are booking at the 5-star hotel, you are also going to pick or choose some facilities that is provided in that hotel. For example, if you are not opting for swimming pool, if you are not opted for swimming pool, then you are not allowed to enter into swimming pool. Okay, you are authenticated. You can enter into hotel room. You can stay there, but you are not authorized. You don't have any permission to enter into swimming pool. So that is called authorization, which means every authenticated user is not an authorized user, but an authorized user is automatically an authenticated user. Now, try to understand this point and let's move on to the next point. Just a second. So I can able to write a point like this. Authorization, authentication. First, let us understand two things, then we'll understand about Spring Security. We'll dive into Spring Security. So authorization means just a process. It's a process of verifying the access permissions of an authenticated user. Access permissions of an authenticated user. Okay. authenticated user for a particular resource. For a particular resource. So feel that every authenticated user is not an authorized user. Do remember this point. But every authorized user is obviously an authenticated user because authorization comes after authentication. First authentication comes, then next after that authorization comes. Okay. In terms of programming, authentication is nothing but verifying the user credentials. Authorization is nothing but verifying the role of a user. In terms of programming, authorization means verifying the role of a user. Right. So we have given username and password or Zoom ID and password so that you guys can able to attend this meeting. Right. But you are not unable to share your screen. You can't able to share your screen because you are authenticated, but you are not authorized. Okay. You are not the host and you are not the co-host of this meeting, which means what your role is just a participant, but your role is not a host or a co-host. Okay. Right. So you don't have any permission to share your screen or you don't have any permission to record this meeting. Okay, because your role is just a participant, but not a host or a co-host. Only host or a co-host can able to record the meeting or can share their screens. This is called authorization. So first authentication, then followed by authorization. Now, how to implement this authentication authorization in terms of the Spring programming? So these are the two core concepts of security. Now, Spring security is a module, and this module has provided some predefined filters. Actually, if there is no Spring security module provided, then as a developer, we need to define filters, web filters. Like when you are working or when you are learning about servlet API, you might have understood about how a filter can be created. A filter is a component which can do some pre-processing before actually the request reaches to the particular resource like a servlet, right? Or when the response of a particular servlet or some JSP, whoever, and before its response reaches to the client in the middle, you can do some kind of post-processing operations. So to intercept the request or response and perform some kind of middle operations, you need to define a filter. You have to define a filter. So now, when you come to Spring Security module has provided a group of predefined filters, built-in filters. And that filters will handle all the various aspects of the security. And the Spring Security module has also provided all the filters in a specific order in which order they must execute. So they are all going to execute sequentially. For an example, there is a login filter and a logout filter. Logout filter should not execute before login filter, right? So the order of execution is first login filter, at the end logout filter. So Spring Security has given a predefined built-in filters that will handle various aspects of the security. And these filters are also ordered and they are going to execute sequentially. And so that as a developer, just I can use the Spring Security module support in order to implement security for my REST API. So which is nothing but I no need of manually defining any filters. I can just use the support of Spring Security module. And we are going to discuss what is the flow and some of the filters, like what are the filters that are going to be executed as part of the request flow, and at different filters, what operations are going to be done. And then we are going to discuss how to implement it into our application and how can we able to secure our REST API endpoints with the help of Spring Security module. So that is the first part of this this workshop, Spring Security. So then again we implement the security with JWT tokens on the REST API. And then next we are going to discuss how OAuth2 protocol can be used to implement security on the REST API. That's why the session definitely need REST API knowledge in Spring Boot. Because when I'm just open my application and if I show the endpoints and annotations, so if you want to understand them, if you want to first get immediately like what this is and what this operation is going to be, what operation is going to be done like that. So you should be aware of having the REST API skill, how to create REST API in Spring Boot. Using Spring Boot, how to build the REST API. So that is a prerequisite skill so that you can able to understand this 4 to 5 sessions of this workshop, and you can get a good clarity on how we can able to implement security for REST API. Okay, right. Now coming to the point here, authorization means role of a user. It's just going to verify the role of a user. Authorization means verifying the role of a user better. Okay, now just now I told you Spring Security module has provided built-in filters to handle the various aspects. Various aspects means authentication, authorization, session management, logout, HTTPS channeling. Okay, many things are there. That's why I'm writing simply various aspects. Built-in filters to handle the various aspects of security. Okay, so what does it mean now? As a programmer, you no need to define any filters by yourself. You no need to define any filters by yourself. Already the Spring Security has defined all the filters required, and also in which order the filter should execute, that order also defined. And with all this order, it has created one concept called Spring Security Filter Chain. Okay, so what Spring Security has defined? It has defined the filters in which order they must execute, and all this order is composed into a concept called a Spring Security Filter Chain. Now that filter chain is containing all the filters and also the order of execution of those filters. And of course, I'll tell you some of the filters, but you need to understand about a filter means just it is a component, and that component is going to execute while request is traveling from the client or the user towards the resource. The resource could be your the REST controller, or the resource could be a servlet like that, dispatcher servlet. Okay. Now, Spring Security has our Spring Security module has defined the order of the filters execution, and compose this order into better word, or given this order better, and given this order as Spring Security Filter Chain. Okay. Now, what this Spring Security Filter Chain contains? It contains a group of filters, and the filters are ordered so that whenever any request is coming from the client or from the user, then the filters are executed one after the other sequentially. Oh, correct. Now, we cannot discuss about each and every filter and how that is executing and all these kind of things. That is going to be more in detail, but at least we have to know about some of the filters that are going to be executed sequentially as part of the Spring Security filter chain. Okay. So let's understand about some of the filters that I'm going to explain you, that is Spring Security filter chain filters. Okay. Once you got this, then we will see what is a flow. And then next we are going to understand about how this security can be implemented to our application, what is the dependency to be included, and what is the configurations that you need to define. And once we do that, then we are going to test whether the REST application or our backend application is a secured, and or is it allowing every user to access it. Okay, so those things will be discussed as a part of this. Now, let's understand some filters in this Spring Security filter chain. Okay, just I'm just going to write some of the filters. Right, one is channel processing filter. You have to know just only some filters name. Channel processing filter means it will check whether the request is coming through the required protocol or not. Required protocol in the sense, I want to make my application to be accessible with HTTP, or I would like to make my application to be accessible with HTTPS. Okay, so this filter will check whether the request is coming from the client or from the user with the requested protocol or not. The protocol requested is HTTP or HTTPS. Okay, these are the two web protocols that we use. That this is the first filter, channel processing filter, right? And if suppose any exception occurs during the filter operation, for example, then there is a another filter who is going to take care of handling the exceptions. So that will provide us some response page, right? And that page is actually going to contain the detailed information about like why the request got failed. So that exception handling is a built-in part of this Spring Security filter chain. Next, let me write some of the names. Security context persistence filter. Okay, I'm just only writing some of the names, right? There is username password. For your information, I'm writing username password authentication filter. Right. There is something called CSRF filter. CSRF stands for cross-site request forgery. Cross-site request forgery. CSRF filter. It is a kind of attack. CSRF attack. Okay. So this filter will protect against this CSRF attacks. So there will be a CSRF token sent in the request, and this filter checks whether that token is sent in the request or not, and if the token is matches with the token provided to that page or not. So that is called the CSRF token. So basically this filter will check for the CSRF token to prevent the CSRF attacks. CSRF stands for cross-site request forgery. Cross-site request forgery. Right. Session management filter. So this will handle session related security. So this filter will check whether the maximum concurrent users or maximum concurrent sessions, right? So for example, when I'm developing an application, I would like to maintain in a server, let's say for example, a 1000 concurrent sessions only. Maximum 1000 sessions I would like to maintain at server. So this filter will check, okay, whether maximum concurrent sessions is reached or not. If reached, then it will throw an exception. That's what session management. It will take care of session related security. Then we'll be having something called as exception translation filter. So whatever the exceptions that are coming in Spring Security, like authentication exception or access denied exception, this type of exceptions will be thrown in the Spring Security. So this filter will catch them, will handle them, and will redirect that user to some pages, like again back to the login page or back to the access denied page, like that. So that is called exception translation filter. Right. Now, similarly, we have something called as logout filter. We have something called as logout filter. Logout filter. So it will monitor whether the request is coming to the configure logout URL. If yes, it will start initiating that logout process. So this filter will handle the logout operation, gracefully logging out an user by invalidating the session or by deleting the cookies, if any created at the server. So that is basically called as logout filter. So it is just going to monitor whether any request is coming to the configured logout URL. And if yes, it will start initiating that logout process. That is called logout filter. Okay, right? Yeah. So there are other filters are also there, but let's see the final one, that is this is also one filter security interceptor. Basically, it is one of the important one, filter security interceptor. So this will take the access decision for the request. The access decision will be taken by this filter. For example, if the user is authenticated and if user is authorized successfully, then this filter will take a decision, okay, the access is allowed for this user. If authentication successful but authorization is failed, right, then it will throw some exception like access denied exception. So that a translate exception translation filter can catch it and can handle it. It will send one access denied page or again login page back to the user. So this is the, basically we can say this is the decision maker. And this is a final filter in this filter chain. Okay, right? This is a final filter in the filter chain. And here it will make the access decision for the request. Okay. So these are some of the filters that you have to know. These are some of the filters that you have to know, right? Okay. Yeah, I will answer some of your questions, but later. Okay. More or less all questions are same. I'll just answer them. Okay. So yes, I saw in chat that is this complete workshop is only for 1 day free or is this for 4 5 sessions? So this is a free workshop for entire security. Entire security, I mean, it will be for till this next 4 to 5 sessions until the security concepts are completed. Okay, right. And Some guys are asking about recording available. It is available on YouTube. Okay. You can watch from our YouTube channel, Ashok IT YouTube channel. Okay. Right. Now let's move on. So I have to explain many things. So let's move on. So then let's understand about what's the flow that when you are trying to make a request, right? What is the flow that we need to understand now, right? What's the flow that we need to understand now? For example, there is an API, a secured API. Secured API mean suppose this is my application. Consider this is my application. Sorry, I'll change the color. Now this is my application. In my application, there are different endpoints are there. Okay, there are some URLs are there. URL1, URL2, URL3. Okay, or let's say for example, I have some endpoints. Some of the endpoints are accessible with HTTP GET method. Some of them are accessible with HTTP POST method. Some of them are accessible with HTTP PUT method, right? So my application is containing a set of URLs. Set of URLs slash API, okay, slash user slash ID slash API slash users, right? Slash API slash save. So some set of URLs are there in my application, okay? Slash API slash delete slash ID. This is my server side application. Okay. This is my server side application. And now the client or a user is making a request to one of these URLs. Then we need to understand about how the flow will be, because for example, delete is there, or for example, save the URL is there. So I don't want to allow everyone to do these operations. I don't want to allow everyone to access these two. I want to secure these two URLs. Only admins can do this. Only admins can able to access it. Admins can able to save a new user data. Admins can able to delete a user. They can add a user or they can delete a user, right? And rest of the guys, rest of the users, they can fetch the details of a user. They can access this URL to get the details of a user. They can access this URL to get all the user details. Okay, means some endpoints, I want to make them available publicly for every user. But for some URLs, authentication and authorization are required. Means I want to secure some endpoints, some URLs of my application, and I want to permit everyone to access my some URLs of my application. So we have to configure. We are going to write some configuration like these URLs should be accessible to only admins. These URLs are permitted to every user. These URLs are permitted to only authenticated users. May not be authorized, but authentication is mandatory. Like that, we are going to define some security configuration, and that configuration we are going to put in a configuration class in our Spring Boot project. Now, back to the point. That was the flow. Consider that there is a user or a client. A client is making a request. A client is making a request, right, to a secured endpoint, a secured URL of my application. Then what's the flow, right? I am not enabling HTTPS communication. So protocol can be HTTP. I'm not adding any HTTPS channel support. I'm not saying that HTTPS channel is required. Just HTTP is okay. The protocol is HTTP protocol only for communication, right? So when a user is trying to when a user is trying to access any secured resource, first the user is provided with a page, a login page, that Spring Security will handle that. It initially provides a login page for the user to provide his credentials, right? I repeat, and you need to get this, and it's a very simple one, okay? For example, a client wants to access a secured URL of my backend application. Then Spring Security will provide a login page, or we can say one login dialog box. Okay, I'll tell you that all depends on uh, the type of authentication. Either login page or login dialog box will be provided to the user. Okay. Now let us understand about the flow. When a user is trying to make a request, right? User will be provided with a login form, a login page that Spring Security will provide. So now basically you just understand that, okay, Spring Security has provided one login page. Because this client is trying to access a secure resource, some secured URL, right? And this is considered a login page or login form, whatever it is that Spring Security has provided. And in which the username and password are entered by the user, entered by the client. Right? Then this page will send, when user clicks on submit, this page now will send a request. When the page will submit the request to, or in other way, I can say when the request is moving to the server application, the backend application, in the middle, there is a username password authentication filter. So there is a filter. That filter will intercept this request. This is called username password authentication filter. Username password authentication filter. I'm just writing UPAF in short. Username password authentication filter. Right? And what this filter will do, it will prepare one authentication object. It prepares an authentication object. Right? It prepares first one authentication object. This is something called as, I'm writing AO, authentication object. Authentication object to store these credentials like username and password. Okay, right? Understand here. After preparing authentication object, now this filter is actually going to invoke one internal component called as authentication manager. I'll give a big diagram, but just let me explain first, and after that I'll give the complete diagram, okay? It invokes authentication manager. I'm simply calling this guy as AM. Okay. This filter will first prepare an authentication object. We'll put all the credentials like username and password in this authentication object, and then it invokes authentication manager, and we'll provide this authentication object to authentication manager. Now this authentication manager is just going to act like a mediator. What this will do, it will delegate this request to another guy, and that guy is called authentication provider. Let me call it as AP. In short, I'm calling it as AP, authentication provider. Authentication manager, authentication provider. So authentication manager delegates the request to authentication provider. Right? Now this authentication provider, right, will load the user details. I'm just calling it as UD, user details. It loads user details from user details object. UDS, user details service object. Where is user details? The user details are available either within my application. I can just test as a local application. Otherwise, I can keep the user details in a database. Let's say consider the user details are available in database. Now this authentication provider loads the user details through user details service object. These are the different components involved in the flow. Right? So see, as we know that there is a username and password authentication filter, UPAF, username password authentication filter. It prepares or creates one authentication object and will store the credentials given by the user. Then we'll pass it to authentication manager. Authentication manager will delegate it to authentication provider. Right? It delegates it to authentication provider. This authentication provider will load user details through user detail service from database or from in-memory. In-memory means users are configured within application itself. For testing purpose, we can configure within application only without hitting the database. Okay? Or else, even it can be loaded from database also. So user detail service object. Now through user detail service, it is going to load the user details from the database or from in-memory. And now this authentication provider is now going to compare the user details with the user details available in AO. Now it is going to take care of authentication. Right? If details are mismatching, then it will throw authentication exception. Then there is a filter in the Spring Security that catches the exception and will send again login page back to the user with the appropriate error message like bad credentials. Okay, bad credentials, something like that. Got it? Now, that's good. Suppose if credentials are valid, then it returns the authentication object back to the authentication manager. The authentication object now contains not only the given username and password, even what is the role of that user which is loaded from database, that is also included in authentication object. Okay. Now that authentication object will be kept into a security context. Okay. Now it is going to keep that in a security context object. And the security context object is managed by security context holder. This is a flow. This is a security context object which is managed by security context holder. Now this authentication object, the fully loaded authentication object will be kept into security context object. I'm writing SC, which is managed by security context holder. Right. Now this authentication object now contains not only the credentials, the valid credentials of the user. Now it also holds the role of the user, which is loaded from database or from in memory. But this authentication provider can only verify the credentials, but it does not verify the role. Okay, it only verifies the credentials, but not verify the role. If credentials are valid, now it will populate the role into authentication object and will give it back to the authentication manager. It will put it into a security context object. Right? And this security context object is managed by security context holder. So once this process is completed, then next, the filter security interceptor. The filter security interceptor is called after this. After putting it in security context, this authentication manager is now going to call filter security interceptor. I'm simply calling FSI. I'm calling it as FSI, filter security interceptor. It is another filter, right? And now this particular filter security interceptor is going to verify the role. As I told already, this is the final filter. Of course, in the middle, some other filters are executing, that session management filter, CSRA filter, they are executing. So that, um, I mean, we can't discuss at this stage now. Okay, we want to at least understand about high level flow, right? Now, this is a final filter. This is the filter which can make the access decision for the request, right? Now it will check whether the whether the authenticated user role, because it is going to verify the authorization, right? It's not performing authentication. This will take care of authorization, right? Now this will verify, this filter will verify whether this authenticated user's role is matching with the role defined in the security configuration of the application or not. Because in my application, I'm just going to define some roles. Allow only the users with this role to access this URL, and allow only users with this role to access this other URL. So this filter, filter security interceptor, okay, it will check whether the authenticated user's role is matching with the role defined in the security configuration of the application or not. And if it is yes, then this filter will next forward the request to the front controller of the Spring Web or Spring REST applications. That is called dispatcher servlet. So before the request reaches to this entry gate, as we know, as a Spring or Spring Boot WebMVC application developer or REST API application developer, we know that the first stop for every request that is coming from the clients will be dispatcher servlet. But now before my request reaches to dispatcher servlet, all these things will happen. All these things will happen in the sense what? Authentication is completed. Session management related task is completed. CSRF token related things are completed. Authorization is completed. Now finally the request reaches to dispatcher servlet. And once it reaches to dispatcher servlet, remaining flow as a WebMVC application programmer or REST API application developer, we know that it makes call to handler mapping, then to REST controller or a MVC controller, depends on whether your application is MVC or REST. Then that REST controller will invoke service layer. It may call repository to fetch the data from database. Okay, all these things will happen. So this is how the flow, like what happens when a request is coming from the client before it reaches to the entry gate called dispatcher servlet, how the security gets handled. That's what is flow. This diagram is talking about all these kind of things, right? So this is an important aspect or important concept that everybody has to know before you start adding the dependency, start writing the configurations part and testing the application with by sending a request to some secured endpoints and some unsecured endpoints before doing all these things. So we have to know that this is what happening actually, right? Good. So overall, what happens now whenever a user makes or a client makes a request to a secured endpoint? First, Spring Security will provide one login page. Spring Security will provide one login page. Got it? And when the details are submitted from the login page, and this is what all happening. There is a authentication filter. It will collect all the credentials and will prepare one authentication object. Then it will provide that to authentication manager. Now the authentication manager will delegate the request to authentication provider, which is going to validate the credentials by loading the user details from user detail service. It could be in-memory user details or it could be database user details. And if authentication successful, like username and password is okay, then this authentication provider returns a fully loaded authentication object, like including the role, the username, the password, and role because he's authenticated. So that fully loaded authentication object will be returned to authentication manager and it will put it in security context. So security context holds authentication object of authenticated user. Authentication object of authenticated user. That will be placed into security context. We'll understand more importance of the security context next. And this security context is managed by security context folder. Next. Once this is happening, or once this is completed, then authentication manager is next going to call filter security interceptor, the final filter in the chain. And now that will verify whether authenticated user's role is matching with the role configured in application security or not, in the security configuration of the application. If the both roles are matched, then it will allow this user to access the resource. Access is granted. Now the request is forwarded to dispatcher servlet. If in case access roles are mismatching, in application configuration, I gave admin only accessible for admins. but this user is not admin, he is an accountant, right? So then this filter will throw access denied exception. And there is a exception translation filter, and that filter is going to handle the exception and will send appropriate page to the client or user saying that access denied, right? You are not authorized to access this resource, or your credentials are invalid. Okay, it will return those pages back. This is how it is going to happen. Okay, this is how the flow is going to be. And of course, I'll provide you all these things, right? Okay, now let's move on. So once you got to know about the flow, now it is a time to understand about how to write the security configuration in my web application. And for that, first we need to have an application, right? We need to have an application. And next we need to understand about how we can able to define the security configuration in a application and what's the dependency that we need to be added. So all these things I'm going to show by opening the one REST application. First, we will take up one REST application which contains CRUD operations. Let's say CRUD operations on employees, and I will first remove the unnecessary things from that application. I will make it like a basic CRUD operation application, and then we are going to implement security on that. Okay, let's start working on this. So I'm going to use IntelliJ IDE. So I'll start my IntelliJ, and I'm just going to explain about what configurations that you need to write and what does it mean. Those things I'm going to explain. Right now, we have completed about the flow, how my request, or I mean a user's request or a client's request reaches to dispatcher select. How this authentication and authorization are happening in the middle with the help of the filters and other components. Let's move on. This is how the flow, right? Next, let's move on. The FSA position is very last, the last filter. Okay. Next. Okay. Okay. Now let's move on. Let us, what we can say, let us start understanding about the complete flow. Look at the flow now. Okay. Of course, I can able to write it now, but writing is going to take more time, and that too within the stipulated time that we need to understand. So you can see this. I'll be giving the detailed flow diagram from the existing doc. Now this is the flow. That's how we have discussed, and this is the diagram in which the entire flow diagram, that so far whatever I've explained, that is the actual Spring Security flow diagram. And now we are going to discuss and understand about application. Let's start understanding about application. I think you are missing some diagram. Okay, let me do one thing. Let me do one thing. And at the end of the session, the document will be placed in the chat box, and you need to download directly from the chat. The file you need to download from the chat box itself. First, let me keep the flow. And now the flow diagram. Now this is a flow diagram. That's so far what we have discussed. Okay, right. So you can go through that flow diagram next. Now coming to application point of view. Now we want to create, or I mean to say that we want to use an application in which we are going to implement security. First, I want to make my application as ready for adding the security features, and then we'll start adding the dependency in the pom.xml file. Then we are also going to add the security configuration for my application, and we are going to discuss about how we can able to define a security configuration file and what are the configuration steps that we need to follow that I'm going to explain you, right? Those things we are going to discuss next. So for that, I need to make my application. Let's start with IntelliJ. Let me open an application. So this is a CRUD application, but of course, I'm just going to delete some things and I would like to make it clear. So for that, you need to just wait for 1-2 minutes. Now you can see that this is the REST API, employee REST controller. But before I start adding security features, first I would like to remove some things. Just I want to make it as a basic CRUD application. Then I'll talk about what security configuration that we need to define. I would like to make it as a just simple basic CRUD application, okay? Using REST API. We'll take only one media type. Okay, I'll take only one media type. I'm just going to use everything like JSON only. Like a request data format is JSON, response data format is also JSON only. Okay, request and response, both the data formats are JSON only. I'm just going to make my application as simple as possible, and so that we can able to directly implement security on this, and then we can able to discuss authentication authorization on this. That's it. Okay. Now this is my, okay, this is my REST controller, and which calls an employee service. This is the application that we are going to use. It has various endpoints. I will list out all the endpoints that this application is going to do, or what are the endpoints that this application has, right? You don't worry on that. I'm just going to tell you that. I'm just going to tell you that next. But before I'm just going to remove the unnecessary things, and so that it will be good. Okay. And right now we are not discussing about any caching. I'm deleting all the caching related things. Now it is okay. Okay, done. Now I just want to delete the dependencies which are not required right now, and also the configuration settings which are not required. All those things I'm going to delete. Okay. So that this is a basic employee CRUD application. Now this is a basic employee CRUD application, and which uses MySQL as a backend, and the server runs on the port number 8082. Right now, let's move on to the form.xml. And I just want to remove whatever the dependencies which are not needed from this application. Okay, done. Now coming to security. See, the first thing, to your REST application, suppose you have an application and now you want to add security, you want to implement and you want to secure some um, the application URLs, some endpoints of your application using Spring Security module. So then you need to add a starter called Spring Boot Starter Security Dependency. So this is the dependency that you need to write. Dependency. The dependency has a artifact ID called Spring Boot Starter Security. And the group ID is arg.springframework.boot. So this is the dependency that we need to add, and we are going to sync the changes with the IDE. Sync Maven changes. So you have a sync icon over there, and you are just going to, otherwise you can use Control Shift Q, sorry, Control Shift O, the shortcut. Sorry, this is Spring Boot Starter Security. It's not dot, okay? Spring Boot Starter Security. No problem. Let's sync it again. Now it's resolving the dependencies. It's doing the internal work. It is loading the libraries from Maven Central Repository. And now this is the dependency that we need to include in our application. Spring Boot Starter Security Dependency. Next. How to define the security configuration. Now, consider I'm just creating one sub package under my base package called in.ashok IT. And in this, I want to define some security configuration. Let's see how we can able to define the security configuration. Right. Let's see how we can define the security configuration. First, let's start with the basic, then later we will enhance it and we are trying to understand more on that. Okay. So first, let me create a new package, a sub package under this particular in.ashok IT. Let's say consider in.ashok IT dot security dot config. Now this is my package. Now here I'm just going to create a new class. And this is my application security. Just I'm defining a class, my application security. Okay. This is my application security. Now, first of all, it's a configuration class. As we know that as a Spring or Spring Boot developer, to mark that this is a configuration class, then we have to add an annotation called at configuration. At configuration. Right? Good. Now come to the point. In this class, I need to define my security configuration. Like I need to specify, okay, who can access my application, which user can access, which role of users can access, which URLs must be authenticated, which URLs are permitted to all, right? I need to define all such kind of things. I need to define all these kind of things, right? Okay. So for that, I need to add annotation called @enable web security. There is one annotation provided. Okay. This will enable web security configuration in our Spring or Spring Boot application. The annotation is @enable web security. Right. And here we can customize the security configuration according to our application. Which request to be allowed, which request should not be allowed, to which URL the request should be allowed, to which URL request should not be allowed. We can able to define all these configuration. That's called customization. So we can do the customization here by adding the annotation @enable web security. Right? And now I have to define the security configuration. You can define the security configuration by creating a bean. A bean method can be created by using annotation @bean. @bean public security filter chain, Spring security filter chain. Okay, I'm just going to define a method with security filter chain. No web filter chain, it is security filter chain. And the method is filter chain and the parameter is HTTP security. Now we'll import all the required things. So this is the method in which I should start adding my security configuration. It's a bean method. It should return a bean of type security filter chain. And the ID of this or the name of this into the Spring container should be filter chain. So @bean method, as we know, when you read the bean, it indicates that the method produces a bean to be managed by the Spring container. So whatever the bean this method is producing, that is going to be managed by Spring container. So this is going to produce a bean of type security filter chain, and that is going to be managed by Spring container. And that bean is managed or identified with a name called filter chain, because method name will be the name of the bean, right? So security filter chain with method name filter chain. And now here I should define my configuration, right? I should define my configuration. Now what's the config? Let's see first, we are going to add simple configuration. Simple configuration, I mean, I do not want to secure anything. I want to allow every request, every HTTP request. I mean to say that I'm not specifying that this URL must be secured, this URL must not be secured, not like that. Just for example, like unsecured application. Let's see how we can do that. Let me, I can add throws exception later, HTTP dot. Okay, let me write HTTP dot authorize HTTP requests. It's a method. And it has a parameter customizer. Customizer, customizer is a functional interface. And you know, we can provide the functionality with Lambda expression. If any method has a parameter of type functional interface from Java 8, then we can provide the functionality by defining a Lambda expression. Right? Now I'm just going to specify like this. Authorize arrow token. It's a Lambda expression. Authorize dot request matches. Now in the request matches, I need to specify which URLs, which HTTP method, right? And which role of user has to access it. That's a configuration part, right? So if I decrease the font size a little bit so that you can able to see a little bit clear. Okay. Okay. Now I can say authorize dot request matches. Now in request matches, I'm writing something like this. I need to specify the pattern. Pattern is any request and accessible to everyone. Slash double asterisk means anything, any request. And I do not want to provide any kind of restriction. I want to say permit all. Permit all. So permit all in the sense there is no security, no endpoint is secured here. Everyone can access the endpoints, the entire application endpoints. We don't have any security specially. Just permit all. So this is the meaning of this. If you want to specify that only this role of users can access it and remaining are not accessible, right? Then I have tried like this. See, for example, let me write something like this. At least some security configuration that we can understand today, right? HTTP method dot delete, right? And the URL is, the pattern is slash API slash delete slash ID. Right? Dot has any role. Okay? Of admin. Right? Authorize request matches. HTTP method delete. Pattern is API slash delete slash ID. This is an endpoint I have in my application. And I want to allow only admin to access it. I do not want to allow anybody else. Only admin can access it. Has any role of admin. right? Next. Again, now I want to call dot request matches. This is called method chaining. Now any request. Now I'm not specifying anything, remaining all, except that remaining all. Remaining all permitted to all. Right? Remaining all is permitted to all. Now, as you can see, we are calling a method called authorize HTTP request, and it is a method of HTTP security, and it accepts customizer as a parameter, which is a functional interface. So we are providing a Lambda expression, authorize arrow token, authorize dot request matches, and one is a delete endpoint. So this delete URL accessible to only admin. The role of the user must be admin. Everyone is not allowed. He must be authenticated and must be authorized. His role must be admin. And remaining any pattern is permitted to all. Right? And now we need to configure HTTP mechanism. That is nothing but whether login page should be sent to the user by Spring Security or a login dialog box should be sent. Suppose I want to say that send a login page. That is called form-based authentication. Dot form login with the customizer defaults. So of course, I'm just getting an error here because unhandled exception. Unhandled exception is java.lang.exception. So I can do one thing, throws exception. I can propagate the exception, right? Throws exception. Now I can get out of this error. I can get out of this error. I can get out of this error. Right? Now, what it should return? It should return security filter chain object, right? Okay. We will return that. And the other thing, okay, the other thing, by default, CSRF is enabled. Cross-site request forgery is enabled by default when you add the Spring Security dependency in the pom.xml file. So right now, we are not working on any CSRF. So I just want to disable that. Then I can say CSRF.disable. I can say CSRF arrow CSRF.disable. I can do this. Okay. Now we need to call a method called build method, which can produce security filter chain object. Return http.build. Right? CSRF arrow CSRF. It means we are not working on any CSRF right now. Of course, it is saying that what lambda can be replaced with method reference, but I can write method reference like colon disable, right? But it's only suggestion. I'm just going with that. Okay. Right. Then there is a build method. This build can build an object of type security filter chain. Now, according to my configuration, except this one endpoint API delete / ID, remaining all accessible to everyone, permitted to all. But only this particular endpoint is accessible to a user with role admin. But I have not configured who is admin, what is his username and password, right? and who are having other roles, who is admin, who is user, who is manager, right? That is called user details. There are two options to me. One is I can able to configure them within my application for testing, or I can also create uh, tables in database and I can maintain the users out of my application in a database and I can load them from database. That is called in-memory authentication and database authentication. We'll be having two things. One is called in-memory authentication and second one is called database authentication. Right. Okay. So if you want to quickly test your application or for a small application, you can store the details within your application itself. That's called in-memory, right? And if you take a real-time scenario, then you have to manage the users, their roles. That should be managed in a database, not within application, right? So both we will see with this example. One is with in-memory user details manager and with JDBC user details manager. Okay. So we need to configure that, but that configuration part we are going to discuss in the further session, in the next session. So we are going to stop the session over here and its continuation part will be in the tomorrow session. So once we complete the user details configurations, then we are going to test this application, whether is it providing security? Is it allowing only authorized users to access this endpoint? Or is it allowing everyone to access it? Right? So we are going to see a practical in the session tomorrow by completing the remaining configuration part. Its continuation part will be in the tomorrow session. So hope you guys have understood about the Spring Security flow, what authentication means, what authorization means, and what's a dependency to be included if I want to take the support of Spring Security module and if I want to secure my REST API in Spring Boot application. And next, we have discussed about some sample configuration, like how we can able to define the configuration by creating a configuration class. So it's a continuation will be discussed in the tomorrow session with configuring the user details and testing the application. And let's do some changes to the security configuration. Let us retest the application. And then you will get a complete picture about how this Spring Security module is securing our REST API endpoints. And for today, this is a session. Let's discuss the continuation part in the tomorrow session at the same time. Thank you. Now I'll take up the